My mother-in-law called me a gold digger at my own wedding. With 240 guests watching, my husband frozen beside me, and my dead mother's name dragged through a room full of old money. My name is Briar Vale. I'm a pediatric ICU nurse from Millbridge, Pennsylvania, and I had already signed a prenup that gave up every claim to Harrow House, the family foundation, the trust, and every dollar people thought I wanted. The proof was sitting outside in my father's truck. But I didn't reach for it, because the moment Celeste Harrow said I was just like my mother, my father stood up, looked at her like he had been waiting 29 years, and revealed the name she had buried before she became a Harrow. Chapter 1. The microphone at Harrow House. The first time my mother-in-law called me a gold digger, she did it with a microphone in her hand and 240 people watching me decide whether to fall apart. It was October 18, 2025, at Harrow House in the Hudson Valley, the kind of estate people described with words like historic and gracious, because saying enormous and cold would have sounded impolite. The ballroom had crystal chandeliers, long tables dressed in white linen, tall arrangements of white flowers, and portraits of dead Harrows, looking down from gilded frames as if even they had been invited to judge me. I had been married for less than 3 hours. My name was Briar Vale. I was 34 years old, a pediatric ICU nurse at St. Brigid Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and that morning I had married Elliot Harrow, the 36-year-old operations director of the Harrow Family Foundation. On paper, I was now part of one of those old families with preservation trusts, donor dinners, scholarship funds, and a house large enough to make a person lower her voice without being asked. But standing in that ballroom, with my wedding dress brushing the polished floor, and my mother's lace veil pinned into my hair, I did not feel like a wife welcomed into a family. I felt like a woman who had been allowed to stand temporarily in a room that had already decided she did not belong there. Most of the guests were not mine. They were Elliot's world, Harrow cousins with hyphenated names, foundation board members, donors who had their names engraved on hospital wings and museum walls, women who kissed both cheeks and glanced at my dress label with their eyes, men who called Elliot a good man with the soft sadness people use when they think someone has made a mistake. My side fit at 3 tables near the wall. My father, Caleb Vale, sat at one of them in his best suit, the one he had worn to my mother's funeral 4 years earlier and had taken to a tailor in Millbridge so the sleeves would not show his wrists. He was 64, a finished carpenter, with hands that could smooth a warped cabinet door, better than most men could speak an apology. He had been quiet all day. My father was usually quiet in beautiful rooms. Not because they impressed him, but because he had spent his life repairing what wealthy people neglected and understood that expensive things cracked too. Elliot sat beside me at the head table. His knee touched mine under the linen. His hand rested on my leg, warm and steady, until his mother stood. Celeste Harrow did not grab the microphone. That would have been too crude for Celeste. She rose from her seat as if the evening had been waiting for her, touched the sleeve of the singer, smiled at the band, and took the microphone with the calm authority of a woman who had spent 6 decades being obeyed before she finished asking. She was 62, silver-haired, elegant, and terrifying in the way polished things can be terrifying. Nothing about her looked uncontrolled. Not the dove-gray silk dress, not the pearl earrings, not the faint smile she wore as she turned toward the guests. She said she wanted just a few words for her son. Elliot's hand tightened on my knee. Not much. Just enough for me to feel the warning travel through him before it reached me. I looked at him. His face had changed in that small private way a person changes when they know a storm by name. He knew something was wrong. He knew his mother was not standing because joy had overflowed, but he did not stand. That was the first pain of the night, though not the loudest one. The first pain was realizing that the man who loved me could sense danger and still freeze inside the training that had taught him peace mattered more than truth. Celeste began gently, almost warmly. She thanked everyone for coming to Harrow House, said a few polished words about legacy and family, then looked at Elliot with the kind of tenderness that had always made people forgive the sharpness underneath. She said her son had always been generous, sometimes too generous, said. Good men could mistake being loved for being needed. The polite laughter died before it reached the walls. Then her eyes found me. She said some women knew how to make kindness look like rescue. Some women understood that a family name could open doors they had never been able to open alone. Then, in front of 240 guests, she called me a gold digger. For 1 second I heard nothing. Not the band, not the clink of a glass, not Elliot's breath catching beside me. Then she added the part that reached backward through my ribs and found the oldest bruise in me, just like her mother. The room did not explode. No one shouted. No one threw down a napkin. That would have been easier. Instead, the silence cooled around me. A few people looked at me and then away. Someone near the donor table lowered her eyes to my veil. Someone else glanced toward the cake, the flowers, the chandeliers, as if adding numbers in her head. I saw the calculation pass through the room. Nurse. Small-town father. Dead seamstress mother, Harrow groom, historic Sussex estate. Maybe Celeste had only said out loud what some of them had been generous enough to think quietly. I did not cry. I did not move. Outside in my father's truck, parked beyond the maple trees and the rows of black cars, there was a folder that could have ended the accusation in less than a minute. Inside that folder was the prenuptial agreement I had insisted on, signed months before the wedding and notarized properly. There was a letter from my own attorney, Nina Alvarez, confirming independent counsel, full financial disclosure, and time to review every line. There were bank statements, vendor invoices, payment confirmations, and emails showing Celeste had approved the very wedding choices I had paid for myself. That folder held the proof that I had waived any claim to Harrow House, the foundation, the trust, Elliot's separate property, and the family assets people in that room assumed I wanted. It also held the numbers I had built my safety around. $74,000 saved over 9 years. Nearly $58,000 spent trying to make sure no one could say I had taken a thing. That folder could have proven I had not come for Elliot's money. It stayed where I was. My fingers rose to the edge of my veil. The lace was not designer. It was old, tea-colored, and soft from years inside my mother's sewing box. My mother, Maris Vale, had died in 2021, but that morning I had pinned her into my hair thread by thread. She had been a seamstress in Millbridge, Pennsylvania. She had spent her life making other women look beautiful in rooms that would never remember her name. When I was 8, I heard a woman in a grocery store call my mother a gold digger. I did not understand the money part then, because there had never been much money to dig for. I only understood my mother's hand tightening around mine, and the way she kept walking, as if dignity were something you carried by not dropping it. That word had followed me longer than Celeste could possibly know. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. I looked at my father. Caleb had not looked at me first. He was looking at Celeste. Not like a man hearing an insult for the first time, like a man recognizing a face from a room he had spent years trying not to reopen. That morning, ceremony. Celeste had gone pale when my father stepped out of his pickup near the side entrance. She had studied his face, then asked if they had met before. My father had looked at her for a long moment and said they had once, a long time ago. I had asked him what he meant. He had only said some doors stayed closed because someone kind had asked for them to stay that way. Now Celeste had used my mother's name in front of 240 people, and I saw that door open behind my father's eyes. He set his water glass down. The sound was small, a simple touch of glass against linen-covered wood, but in that frozen ballroom it landed like a hammer. My father stood slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket with hands that had built porch rails, repaired church pews, and held my mother through the last winter of her life. Celeste saw him rise, and the color left her face so completely that even the guests near her noticed. Elliot whispered my name, but I could not look at him. My father looked at me once, just once. Not asking permission exactly. Asking if I was still standing inside myself. I was. Then Caleb Vale turned to my mother-in-law and said that if she was going to use his wife's name in that room, then that room was going to hear the name Celeste Harrow used to live under. That was when I understood. My father was not only angry. He had been carrying a secret for 29 years. Chapter 2. The girl refused to owe anyone before my father stood in that ballroom and made Celeste Harrow forget how to breathe. I had spent most of my life believing a person could outrun shame by never owing anyone a thing. I learned that in Millbridge, Pennsylvania, a river town along the Susquehanna, where the old mill stacks still stood like monuments to jobs that had left, before I was old enough to understand what leaving meant. When the plant closed, people did not simply lose paychecks. They lost the rhythm of the town. Men who had worked 40 hours a week started fixing roofs for cash. Women who had packed lunches at dawn started taking night shifts, sewing hems, cleaning offices, watching other people's children. My family was not poor in the way movies like to make poor people look. I had heat most nights, food on the table, clean clothes, and parents who could make a broken thing useful again. But every bill had a sound in our house. The electric bill sounded like my father lowering the thermostat in January. The grocery bill sounded like my mother putting back the grapes and choosing apples because they lasted longer. Gas sounded like Caleb Vale standing at the kitchen counter with a pencil, deciding whether he could take a job 20 miles away if the client wanted to pay him the following Friday. My father was a finished carpenter. He could repair stair rails, old cabinets, crown molding, church pews, porch posts, anything made of wood that had survived long enough to be worth saving. My mother, Maris Vale, was a seamstress. She altered wedding dresses, church dresses, choir robes, first communion veils, bridesmaid gowns that arrived too tight, and mother of the bride suits that arrived too late. People brought my mother their panic in garment bags. She gave it back to them, pressed, mended, and wearable. I was 8 when I first heard someone call her a gold digger. We were in Larkin's Market, standing in line with milk, bread, and a small bag of oranges because I had been sick that week, and my mother said vitamin C was cheaper than missing school. 2 women behind us were talking in the half-whisper adults use when they want children to hear but not answer. One of them said my mother had always been good at finding a man with steady hands. The other laughed and said, Morris knew where to dig, didn't she? Then came the word, old. I remember looking at my mother's hand. It tightened around the handle of the basket, then loosened. She paid for the groceries. She thanked the cashier. She walked me out to the parking lot without turning around. Only when we were in the truck did I ask her what it meant. She looked through the windshield for a long time, then she said, Sometimes, baby, it just means you walk through a door somebody wanted closed. I asked if she had done something wrong. My mother looked at me then, and there was a softness in her face I did not understand until years later. No, she said. But some people need you to feel guilty for wanting a place to stand. After that, I became careful. Not careful the way children are told to be careful near traffic or knives. Careful in a deeper, uglier way. I learned not to ask for expensive shoes. I learned to say I was fine before anyone had to offer help. I learned to keep receipts in a little envelope because numbers felt safer than explanations. I learned that if I paid my own way, no one could claim they had carried me. By the time I became a nurse, that habit had turned into a personality. I moved to Philadelphia after nursing school and started at St. Brigid Children's Hospital in 2016. Pediatric ICU work teaches you the difference between noise and crisis. Machines beep all night. Parents cry in hallways. Doctors speak in low voices behind glass doors. You learn to move quickly without looking rushed, to tell a mother the truth without taking away her ability to stand, to keep your hands steady when everyone else's life has tilted. I was good at it. That mattered to me. At St. Brigid, I was not Caleb's daughter from Millbridge or Maris's girl with the second-hand coat. It was Briar Vale, the nurse who could get an IV in a scared toddler, calm an angry father, and remember which stuffed rabbit belonged in which bed. Jody Park was the first person at the hospital who saw through me. She was 39, our charge nurse, divorced, sharp-eyed, impossible to impress. One night, around 3 in the morning, she watched me eat crackers for dinner because I had picked up another extra shift and said, Briar, you save money like somebody's waiting around the corner to accuse you of stealing it. I told her I just liked having a cushion. She gave me that look nurses give when a patient says their pain is a 2 while gripping the bed rail. A cushion is one thing, she said. A courtroom in your checking account is another. I laughed because I did not want to answer. I met Celeste Harrow in June of 2024 because his nephew swallowed a button battery. That is not a romantic sentence, but it is the truth. His sister came in shaking so hard she could not sign the intake forms. Elliot arrived 90 minutes later from the Hudson Valley, still wearing a suit jacket over a wrinkled shirt. I noticed him because he did not act like the building should rearrange itself around his fear. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask who he needed to call. He did not say his last name like a key. He stood near the wall, pale and quiet, and asked me if his sister needed water. Then he asked if the nurses needed coffee. I said, We always need coffee. That doesn't mean you have to buy it. He gave the first real smile I saw from him. I'm learning the difference between helpful and in the way, he said. That was how Elliot entered my life. Not with money, not with charm, with the rare ability to stand still without making his fear someone else's job. We took things slowly. Coffee after my shift became dinner on my nights off. Dinner became walks along the Schuylkill. Elliot listened when I talked about the hospital. He never asked me to make it prettier than it was. He told me about the Harrow Family Foundation, about scholarships, reservation grants, donor dinners, and the pressure of carrying a name that seemed to arrive in rooms before he did. He told me about his father, Gerald, who had become quieter after a mild stroke in 2022. He told me about Celeste, his mother. She can be intense, he said once. But she means well. I remember smiling because I loved him already, and love can make a warning sound like a quirk. In February of 2025, Elliot proposed in my apartment, not in a restaurant, not in front of a crowd, just beside my kitchen table, with snow tapping against the windows. I said yes before he finished asking. Then 10 minutes later, while the ring still felt strange on my finger, I told him I wanted a prenup. His face changed. Briar, he said, I don't need that. I do. You think I'd let anyone take anything from you? No, I said. I think people believe what is convenient when money is in the room. He sat down slowly. I don't want Harrow money, I told him. I don't want Harrow House. I don't want the foundation, the trust, the inheritance. Any of it. I want it written down before it has a chance to decide I came for something. He looked hurt, but he did not argue forever. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. I hired my own attorney, Nina Alvarez, in Philadelphia. Nina was calm, expensive, and very direct. She reviewed the agreement from Martin Phelps, the Harrow family attorney, and made sure I had full financial disclosure, independent counsel, and months before the wedding to consider every clause. The document said what I wanted it to say. I waived any claim to Elliot's separate property, his inheritance, any future trust distributions tied to Harrow assets, Harrow House, the Harrow House Preservation Trust, and the Harrow Family Foundation. When I told Nina I wanted it airtight, she set down her pen. "This protects you legally," she said. "It won't protect you from being judged." I said, "If it's in writing, they can't say I wanted their money." Nina looked at me for a long moment. People don't always need facts to build a story about you. I should have listened harder. The first time I visited Harrow House, Celeste met me at the front doors as if she had been posed there. Silver hair, cream blouse, pearls, one hand extended, and one hand touching my shoulder as she kissed the air beside my cheek. "So this is the nurse," she said, "not Briar." "The nurse." She asked where I was from before she asked whether I wanted tea. When I said Millbridge, something passed across her face so quickly I almost missed it. Not surprise exactly. Recognition buried under discipline. "Millbridge," she repeated. "How industrious." Then she asked about my parents. "My father is a carpenter," I said. "My mother was a seamstress, Maris Vale. She passed in 2021. For half a second, Celeste looked away, just half a second. Then the smile returned. "How resourceful," she said. I told myself I was imagining the insult because I wanted to be fair. A few weeks later, at a small donor dinner for the foundation, I learned fairness was not always returned. Claire Danvers, one of Elliot's old friends and a donor Celeste clearly adored, smiled across the table and asked if I planned to leave the ICU after the wedding so I could support Elliot's world. Elliot shifted beside me but said nothing. I set down my glass. "Nursing isn't something I'm doing until my real life starts," I said. "It is my real life." Claire blinked. Celeste smiled into her wine. Elliot changed the subject. That night, I called Jody from the guest room hallway while Harrow House glowed behind me like a museum after closing. Jody listened, then said, "Do not spend your life auditioning for people who already cast you as the wrong character." I looked back through the window at the chandeliers, the portraits, the polished stairs, and told myself she was wrong this time. If I did everything properly, if I signed every paper, paid my own way, stood straight, smiled correctly, and never took a dollar that could be held over my head, no one would be able to call me that word again. I did not know then that Celeste had already asked Parker Harrow to look into me. I did not know he would report that I worked nights, saved aggressively, came from Millbridge, and paid my own bills, and I did not know Celeste would not see dignity in any of it. She would see performance. She would see strategy. She would see in me the girl she had buried in herself back in 1996. Chapter 3: The Price of Looking Clean. By the time the prenuptial agreement was signed in May of 2025, I thought the worst of Celeste Harrow's suspicion might finally soften. It did not soften. It changed shape. Before the papers, it looked at me like a question. After the papers, she looked at me like an answer she had expected all along. I had signed myself outside Harrow House, outside the foundation, outside the Preservation Trust, outside Elliot's inheritance, outside every future distribution connected to the family name. I thought that would prove I was not reaching for anything. Celeste seemed to think it proved I knew where the fence was. "The house has always hosted family weddings," she told me once afternoon in the east sitting room, where the furniture looked too expensive to forgive anyone for sitting badly. It would mean a great deal to Elliot. Elliot was beside me, hopeful, nervous. I said, "I don't want your family to feel obligated." Celeste smiled. "Obligation is such an unattractive word. Tradition is better." So Harrow House became the venue for October 18, 2025. No rental fee, Celeste reminded me. As if that generosity erased the fact that every other choice came with a gatekeeper. Her wedding planner was Mara Whitlock, 61, thin as a candle and twice as severe. Mara had organized Harrow galas, foundation dinners, donor weekends, and memorial luncheons where grief came with assigned seating. She carried a leather binder and spoke in a tone that made disagreement feel like arriving undressed. "The florist understands the scale of the ballroom," Mara said. "The caterer has served the family for 3 generations. The baker knows how to work with legacy spaces. The band has the right tone for the house." Every sentence meant the same thing. If I chose anything smaller, cheaper, warmer, or mine, I would make the wedding look like I had touched it. I had $74,000 in savings. 9 years of night shifts had built that number slowly. Extra weekends, holiday pay, Small apartments, no new car, no big vacations. Grocery lists with totals written in the margins. It was not wealth. It was safety, stacked one paycheck at a time. By August, that safety was bleeding out in deposits: caterer, florist, baker, band, dress, stationery, transportation for the few relatives coming from Millbridge, small charges that arrived like gnats and left like bites. I kept a spreadsheet, because spreadsheets did not smile while judging you. By September, I had committed almost $58,000 of my own money to a wedding in a house that still made me feel like an intruder. Elliot tried more than once. "Let me split this with you," he said one night, standing in my apartment while I sorted invoices on the coffee table. "No, Briar, it's our wedding, I know." "Then why does it feel like you're paying a fine?" That should have stopped me. Instead, I clicked open another invoice. "Because if I don't pay it, your mother will make it one." He came around the table and sat beside me. "My mother is difficult. She isn't cruel." I looked at him then. There are sentences that sound like love until you realize they are really protection for the person hurting you. At the hospital, Jody saw what the wedding was doing to me before I admitted it. One morning around 4, I sat in the break room with my forehead against a vending machine coffee cup, trying to remember whether I had paid the final florist balance. Jody dropped into the chair across from me. It looked like a woman financing her own hostage situation. I laughed because if I did not, I might have cried. "It's just expensive." "No," she said. "Expensive is one thing. This is you setting your savings on fire so a rich woman can't call you greedy." I stared into the coffee. "If I pay for it myself, she can't say I took anything." Jody's face softened in the way only a nurse's face can soften, quickly, because we never have long. "Briar, people who want to call you a gold digger don't need invoices. They just need an audience." I carried that sentence back to the PICU with me. That week, I was caring for a 6-year-old named Hazel after heart surgery. Her mother had not slept in 2 days, and I found her standing by the sink, trying to fold a blanket with shaking hands. "You can sit," I told her. "I've got this." She looked at me like I had offered more than a chair. "You always make people feel like they're allowed to be in the room," she said. I almost had to step out. At St. Bridget, I knew who I was. I knew how to help. I knew where to stand. At Harrow House, I felt like I needed permission to breathe near the silver. The only part of the wedding that felt entirely mine came from my mother's sewing box. It was a square wooden box with a cracked brass latch, the kind of thing Maris had kept under her work table in Millbridge. Inside were spools of thread, bent pins, a cloth measuring tape faded at the numbers, and a folded length of lace the color of weak tea. It had come from my mother's own wedding dress, though she had never called it precious. She used to say fabric became precious only when someone loved it enough to save it. Beneath the lace, I found a small envelope I had not noticed before. On the front, in my mother's handwriting, were the words Hartwell Manor, 1996. Inside was a yellowing receipt for emergency bridal repair. No note, just a date, a place and my mother's neat signature at the bottom. I assumed it was one more job. My mother had repaired hundreds of dresses. Brides tore hem zippers failed. Bustles collapsed. Someone always needed saving 10 minutes before walking down an aisle. I put the receipt back and used the lace. For weeks, after 12-hour shifts, I sat at my little kitchen table and sewed the veil by hand. My stitches were not as fine as Maris's. Some were too tight. Once I pricked my finger and left a tiny rust-colored dot near the edge that I had to work carefully around. But the lace held. Night by night, my mother became part of the thing I would wear when I married Elliot. Celeste noticed the veil at the fitting. Mara lifted it between 2 careful fingers and said, "It's sweet, in a homemade way." Celeste stepped closer. For 1 second her expression changed, her eyes fixed on the lace as if it had spoken to her from another room, then the look vanished. "I know a designer in Manhattan who could make something more appropriate for the scale of the house," she said. "No, thank you. This was my mother's." Celeste's smile returned, thinner than before. "Of course, sentiment has its place. There were other cuts, small ones, clean ones." At a bridal luncheon, Celeste introduced me to 2 women as Elliot's nurse bride and added that I insisted on continuing to work after the wedding. One of them said, "How admirable," in the same tone people use for rescue dogs learning stairs. At a planning cocktail hour, Parker Harrow looked at the place settings and said, "Briar will get used to real silver eventually." Elliot heard him. I waited. Elliot only gave a tired little smile and said, "Parker jokes like that." I began collecting those moments in a place inside me I did not want to have. Not as evidence, as bruises. My father arrived late that afternoon, a few hours before the rehearsal dinner, in his old pickup, wearing his navy suit and carrying a garment bag over one shoulder. Harrow House rose behind him like it had been waiting to see whether he would feel small. He did not. He looked at the stone, the trim, the windows, and said, "They need work on that west cornice." I laughed for the first time in 2 days. Then Celeste came out to greet him. She heard his name, Caleb Vale, something drained from her face. When he mentioned Maris, it drained further. "Have we met?" she asked. My father looked at her for a long moment. "Once," he said, "a long time ago." After she went inside, I turned to him. "Dad, what was that?" He watched the door close. Some doors stay closed because a kind person asked us not to make a weapon out of what she gave. "Mom?" He did not answer directly. "It's your wedding tomorrow," he said. "Let's get you through tonight first." The rehearsal dinner was the night before the wedding. Celeste hosted it in the smaller dining room, which still seated more people than any restaurant my family had ever afforded. After dessert, she stood with her wineglass and told a story about Elliot as a boy bringing home a stray dog with a torn ear. "He was always rescuing wounded things," she said, looking down the table at me. "It is one of his most generous qualities." Everyone smiled. Someone said how sweet. Felt the room tilt. Later in the hallway I told Elliot what she had meant. He rubbed his forehead. He was exhausted. So was I. "Briar, I think you're reading into it." The words landed harder than Celeste's had because his were not meant to hurt me. Hurt. Because he wanted so badly for harm to be accidental. That night, after the rehearsal dinner, my father found me outside the guest room, still trying to smile like nothing had touched me. He took one look at my face and did not ask me to explain. "Don't have to stay in a cold house just because they call it beautiful," he said. I leaned my head against his shoulder. "It'll be better after tomorrow." He did not argue. He only held me longer than usual. Later, alone in the bridal room, I placed my mother's veil over the back of a chair. In the yellow lamplight, the lace looked almost alive. Like Maris was sitting there quietly with her hands folded, waiting for me to understand something she had never gotten the chance to say. "I'm going to do this right," I whispered. But I did not know if I meant the marriage, the money, or the impossible work of walking through a door without being accused of stealing the house behind it. Chapter 4. The wedding speech morning came over Harrow House like it had been polished for the occasion. The October light moved through the tall windows in long gold strips touching the old floors, the carved banister, the pale walls. The vases Celeste had filled with white roses before anyone else woke. Outside, the maples were red enough to look unreal, and a white tent had been raised on the lawn, perfect and silent like the house itself had decided to behave. I woke in the bridal room before my alarm. For a few seconds I did not move. I listened to the muted footsteps of staff somewhere below me, the soft clink of glassware being arranged, the distant hum of trucks delivering things I had already paid for. The room smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish. Everything was beautiful in a way that made me afraid to touch it. My dress hung on the wardrobe door. I'd paid for it myself. Not the most expensive dress Mara had suggested, not the designer gown Celeste had called more suitable for the house, but mine. Simple, fitted, soft ivory, with sleeves that made me feel like I could breathe. I washed my face, pinned my hair, did my own makeup with hands that stayed steady, because they had learned steadiness in much worse rooms than this one. Then I opened my mother's sewing box. The veil lay folded inside, tea-colored lace against tissue paper. I lifted it carefully and felt something loosen in my chest. For weeks I had told myself it was only fabric. But when I pinned it into my hair and looked in the mirror, I saw myself at 34. My mother Maris, in every uneven stitch, and the 8-year-old girl in Larkin's Market, who had learned that a word could follow a woman long after the mouth that said it disappeared. I touched the lace near my cheek. "Stay with me, Mom," I whispered. A knock came at the door. "Briar, it's me," my father said. I opened it, and Caleb Vale stood in the hallway in his navy suit, holding himself carefully, like fathers do when they know their daughters are already too emotional, and they do not want to be the thing that breaks them. His eyes went straight to the veil. For a moment, he could not speak. Then he smiled in the smallest way. "Your mother would say those stitches are a little tight near the edge." I laughed, and the laugh came out watery. "She would." He nodded, still looking at the lace. "And then she'd tell everyone not to touch it because it's holding better than theirs." That was the first time all morning I felt like I belonged somewhere. The ceremony took place on the lawn beneath the white tent. 240 guests stood when I appeared. The sound of all those chairs shifting at once moved through me like weather. I held my father's arm. His hand covered mine, rough and warm, and for the walk down the aisle, Harrow House became only stone and glass behind us. Elliot waited beneath the arch of white flowers. He saw me. His face changed so completely that I forgot the donors, the cousins, the board members, the women who had learned to smile without warmth. He looked at me like I was not entering his family's house, but coming home to him. That was why what happened later hurt so much, because Elliot's love was real. It simply had not yet learned how to stand upright in front of his mother. His vows were written on a folded piece of paper, but halfway through, he stopped looking at it. You taught me, he said, voice shaking slightly. That caring for someone doesn't mean keeping everything quiet. It means staying when the truth is hard to say. I remember hearing that and wanting to believe the sentence would protect us. Celeste sat in the front row in dove gray silk. She dabbed the corner of one eye with a handkerchief. Maybe she was moved. Maybe she was performing being moved. I no longer knew how to tell the difference with her. But for the length of the ceremony, with Elliot's hand in mine and my father standing behind me, I allowed myself to hope. The reception began after sunset. The ballroom glowed. Candles reflected in the windows. The cake stood near the far end of the room, 3 tiers of white buttercream and sugar flowers, the least expensive design Mara's baker offered, though it still cost more than any cake my family had ever ordered for any occasion. The band played something soft and expensive. Servers moved like shadows. My father's truck was parked outside beyond the maple trees, and beneath the front seat was the folder I had asked him to keep after the ceremony. The prenup, Nina Alvarez's letter, the invoices, the bank statements, the proof. I thought about it once, then pushed it away. I did not want the first night of my marriage to feel like preparing for court. Elliot and I sat at the head table. Caleb sat near Jody at one of my side's tables, close enough that I could see him when I turned. Aunt Margot Harrow sat with the older Harrow relatives, in an upright, her emerald shawl folded over one shoulder. Parker sat with 2 foundation board members. Claire Danvers sat near the donors. Mara Whitlock hovered at the edge of the room with a headset and a face that suggested even joy should stay on schedule. Martin Phelps, Harrow family attorney, stood near the bar speaking quietly to Gerald Harrow. Then Celeste stood. The best man had been waiting for his cue. The band had softened. Celeste rose as if the pause had been created for her. No one looked surprised. That was how power worked in that room. It did not need permission because it had trained everyone to mistake permission for manners. She took the microphone gently. I promise I won't keep you long, she said. A few people laughed. Elliot's hand found mine under the table. His fingers were cold. Celeste thanked everyone for coming to Harrow House. She said the family was honored to open its doors for such a meaningful day. She spoke of Elliot as a boy, generous, tender, sometimes too ready to believe the best in people. The room smiled at him. Celeste's voice shifted. Families like ours are not built in one generation, she said. They are built by discipline, by sacrifice, by knowing what must be protected. I felt Jody look at me from across the room, Celeste continued. And when a man has a generous heart, he must be careful. Not everyone who comes to the table comes to share a meal. Some people see a light in the window and mistake it for an invitation to reach inside. The room became very still. Beside me, Elliot leaned forward. Mom, he said under his breath, don't. He did not stand. His voice stayed private. Mine was about to be made public. Celeste looked at me. Briar is a nurse, and of course we admire hard work. We admire resilience. We admire women who have had to make their own way. Her smile held. But hardship can become a costume. Need can become a performance, and some women know exactly how to make a good man feel like a savior. A fork touched a plate somewhere and stopped. My body remembered being 8 years old before my mind did. Larkin's Market. My mother's hand tightening on a basket. The oranges rolling slightly when she set them on the checkout belt. Celeste lifted her chin. My son deserved honesty today, so I will give it to him. Briar Vale married into this family for what she could get from it. She is a gold digger. The silence came down hard, then she added, just like her mother. Jody stood halfway, then froze. Parker looked into his wine. Claire's smile disappeared. Martin Phelps went pale in a way I almost would have found funny if I had not been standing inside the wreckage of my own wedding. He knew what I had signed. He knew exactly how little legal ground Celeste had beneath that accusation. Elliot's jaw tightened. He looked at his mother with something like horror. Still he did not stand. I thought of the folder outside. I could bring it in. I could lay the prenup, the invoices, the bank statements, and every clean payment on that head table. It could prove Celeste wrong before the cake was cut. But my hand rose to my veil, and the thought that came next frightened me with its clarity. If I brought that folder into the room, I would be accepting the trial she had created. I would be proving I was innocent to people who had never had the right to accuse me. My father stood, not fast, not dramatically. He placed his napkin on the table, rose from his chair, and buttoned his suit jacket. Celeste saw him and lost every bit of color in her face. Parker started to move, but Aunt Margot lifted one thin hand, stopping him without looking away from my father. Caleb's voice was low, but the room carried it. You used my wife's name in this room, he said, so this room is going to hear what my wife once did for you. Celeste's mouth tightened. This is my son's wedding. No, my father said. You turned it into a courtroom when you accused my daughter. The ballroom did not breathe. Caleb looked at the guests, then back at Celeste. In 1996, at Hartwell Manor in Cold Spring, there was a young bride named Celeste Rowan. She came from Millbridge, she did not come from money, and the Harrow family did not want her walking through their door. A chair scraped near the older relative's table. Aunt Margot Harrow stood slowly, one hand braced on the back of her chair. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. "I remember Hartwell Manor." Celeste turned toward her, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked truly afraid. That was when I knew my father was not telling gossip, he was opening the door. Celeste had kept locked for 29 years. Chapter 5. What My Mother Gave the Name. Celeste Rowan moved through the ballroom like a crack running across glass. For a moment no one seemed to understand what my father had said. Celeste Harrow was not supposed to have another name. Women like Celeste were presented as if they had been born wearing pearls, born knowing which fork to use, born inside houses with wings named after grandfathers. But my father had said Rowan, and Aunt Margot had stood up. Suddenly the room was not looking at me anymore. It was looking at her. Caleb kept his voice low. In 1996, Celeste Rowan married Gerald Harrow at Hartwell Manor in Cold Spring. She came from Millbridge, same town as my wife, same streets, same kind of house, same kind of people your family learned to look past. Celeste's lips parted but no sound came out. Gerald Harrow sat at the family table with both hands folded around his cane. His face had gone gray. I could not tell if it was shame, memory, or the tiredness of a man who had let silence do too much damage for too many years. Aunt Margot's hand trembled against the back of her chair. "It's true," she said. Celeste was a Rowan. Adelaide hated it. The name Adelaide landed almost as hard as Celeste Rowan. My father turned slightly toward the older Harrow table. Adelaide Harrow did not want Celeste in that family. And at that reception, in that house, in front of people who should have protected a bride on her wedding day, Adelaide called her a gold digger. A few guests inhaled, looked at Celeste. For the first time since I had known her, she looked less like a statue and more like a woman trying to hold a door shut with her bare hands. Aunt Margot nodded once, slowly. "She stood right there in her dress," she said. "White as paper." No one helped her. We all pretended not to hear because that is what this family was good at. Caleb's eyes stayed on Celeste. My wife was there that day. Not as a guest. Not as family. She was hired because one of the bridesmaids split a seam that morning, and then the bride's hem tore near the chapel steps. He paused, and I felt my hand rise to my veil again. "Hartwell Manor, 1996, I whispered, the envelope in my mother's sewing box, the old receipt, the emergency bridal repair. My father heard me. He did not look away from Celeste. "No one from the Harrow family knelt down to help the bride they were busy humiliating," he said. "So Maris Vale did." She got down on that cold stone floor with pins between her lips and fixed the hem of Celeste Rowan's wedding dress, while the rest of that room watched her bleed pride. Celeste flinched. The ballroom had become so quiet I could hear the candles flicker. Caleb's voice softened, and that hurt more than if he had shouted. Maris told her to stand up straight. She told her not to let those people decide how small she was. Then she came home and never used the story against her, not once. Because my wife believed kindness was not a debt to collect. Margot lowered her head. "Yes," she said, "I resemble Slamib the seamstress." That was when Celeste truly lost the room. It did not happen loudly. Donors did not gasp. Board members did not storm out. The collapse of a woman like Celeste was quieter than that. It was in Parker Harrow, staring into his lap because his little background check suddenly looked filthy. It was in Claire Danvers no longer looking at me with pity. It was in Martin Phelps, the Harrow family attorney, standing near the bar with his mouth tight because he knew the prenup existed, knew the financial disclosures existed, knew exactly how false Celeste's accusation was. It was in Mara Whitlock, frozen by the wall, unable to schedule or smooth or polish the moment. And it was in two foundation board members exchanging the kind of look Celeste had spent her life avoiding. The look that said this would not stay inside the ballroom. Not after donors had heard her destroy her son's wedding with the same cruelty her own mother-in-law had once used on her. Celeste tried to recover. "That was nearly 30 years ago," she said. "It has nothing to do with this." My father answered before I could. "You made it have something to do with this when you used my wife's name to shame my daughter." Celeste looked at me then, and I saw it. Not regret, not yet, recognition. I was not the woman she hated. I was the mirror she could not bear. Elliot leaned toward me. "Briar," he said quietly, "the folder is in your dad's truck. I can get it. We can show them." For 1 second I imagined it. The signed prenup, Nina Alvarez's letter, the financial disclosures, the invoices and bank statements, every clean payment I had saved, signed, filed away like a wall around myself. I could win. I could make the room feel sorry for me. I could make Celeste look even smaller. But then I looked at my mother's lace resting against my shoulders, and I understood the trap. If I brought the folder in, I would be agreeing that this room had the right to put me on trial. I stood. No, I said. Elliot blinked. No? No folder. My voice was steadier than I felt. I can prove every dollar. I can prove every signature. I can show every person here that I waived Harrow House, the foundation, the trust, the inheritance, all of it. But if I do that, I am still answering your mother's question. I am still acting like my worth belongs in evidence. No one moved. I reached up and unpinned the veil from my hair. The lace came free slowly, soft against my fingers. I held it in both hands the way my mother used to hold damaged fabric before deciding where to begin. This was my mother's lace, I said. Maris Vale did not have a ballroom. She did not have a foundation. She did not have donors, trusts, or a family name that made people lower their voices. But she had mercy, and 29 years ago, she gave it to a woman who had just been humiliated the same way I was humiliated tonight. Celeste's face tightened. My mother did not turn that mercy into a bill. She did not spend the rest of her life reminding you that you owed her. She just let you stand. I placed the veil on the head table beside the cake I had paid for because it was the cheapest beautiful thing Celeste would allow. I have spent too much of my life trying to look clean to people who came into the room with dirt already in their hands, I said. I'm done. Then I turned away from Celeste. I turned away from the donors, the cousins, the board members, the old portraits, the chandelier light, a house that had never once felt warm. I'm going home. I did not look at Elliot when I said it. I did not ask him to come. That choice had to be his, or it meant nothing. I started walking toward the ballroom doors. Behind me, Celeste's voice cracked for the first time. Elliot, sit down. It was not a request. It was the command of his whole life. My steps slowed, but I did not turn. Then I heard his chair scrape. Elliot's voice came behind me, low and broken. You had a woman kneel for you once, Mom. You should have learned mercy. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, he was beside me, not ahead of me, not pulling me, beside me. We walked out of Harrow House together. The night air hit my face like water. I stood in the parking area between black cars and my father's old pickup, breathing as if I had been underwater for years. Elliot did not touch me right away. I'm sorry, he said. I left you alone in there. I looked at him, and the love was still there, but it was no longer enough by itself. I didn't need you to keep the peace, I said. I needed you to tell the truth while I was still in the room. He nodded. No excuse, no defense. I know, I was trained to sit down when she spoke. That is not your burden to carry. My father opened the truck door. You want to go home, Briar? I looked back at Harrow House. The windows were bright. The folder was still under the seat, untouched. For the first time in my life, I had proof and did not need to use it. Yes, I said. I do. 9 days later, Elliot and I were married again at Millbridge Town Hall. The license fee was $45. There were no donors, no foundation board, no ballroom, no Celeste. Jody stood beside me. My father stood behind us. Bev Klein, the county clerk, knew my mother and had to stop for a moment when she saw the lace veil in my hair. This time, the veil was not proof that I deserved to enter anyone's house. It was proof that I already had a place to stand. Celeste kept Harrow House. She kept the portraits, the foundation, the name, and the rooms that had taught people to fear her. But she lost the thing that had made all of it powerful. She lost the right to make us afraid. And I learned that revenge is not always making someone hurt louder than they hurt you. Sometimes revenge is walking out with your name, your truth, and your peace, while they stay behind in the room they built for judging others. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been forced to prove your worth to people who had already decided you were guilty, tell me what you would have done. Would you have brought out the folder, or would you have walked away? Comment I choose if you have ever had to leave a room that kept asking you to prove you deserved respect.